Right after Google X was birthed, trying to sort out with him how we were going to talk about what Google X's mission was. And I was having a hard time getting a crisp answer out of him, so I just started throwing things at him for him to respond to. I said, "Are we a research center?" "No." "Okay, good, glad to hear that." "Are we just another business unit for Google?" "No." "Are we an incubator?" "Sort of, not really." Kennedy's vision statement to the country in 1961 that we would put a man on the moon by the end of the decade was the original moonshot proposal. So it made me really delighted when I threw out, "Are we taking moonshots?" And Larry said, "Yes, that's what we're doing." When we say moonshots, what we mean is that we're shooting for things that are 10 times better, not incremental, 10% kind of improvement. And it's meant to also remind us and remind the world about the risk and long-term nature of the things that we're taking on. We say factory because we want to keep ourselves honest about the fact that in the end, we want to take the risk level of research, but then pursue it with the maniacal focus of a startup, and for the purpose of having real impact in the real world with real people, adding real value, because in the end, Google won't continue to support this if we aren't producing this enough. Or are barely connected to the digital world to actually be connected. We hope to do this by putting up, in the near future, by putting up a network of balloons into the stratosphere, much higher than where the weather is, much higher than where airplanes fly. So you can see, you can think of each of these balloons as being sort of like a cell tower in the sky. It can talk to the phones on the ground and to the other balloons around it. It turns out that this is so high you can't tie the balloons to the ground. And the winds are high enough, there just isn't enough energy up there that you can actually fight the wind to stay in one place for a long period of time. But we've found ways that the balloons can rise and fall about 10,000 feet total. And by rising and falling, they can choose different winds that go in different directions and at different speeds. And that allows them to sail to some extent, and in that way, to have some influence over where they'll be in an hour or in a day. But at the beginning, we couldn't make them go anywhere. We were just starting out. And we couldn't tell them when to come down, which we now can do also. We were working on the basic avionics, which doesn't sound like that much until you realize that we were trying to make a cell tower that was 1% of the weight at 1% of the cost, used 1% of the power. It had to work at 2% of atmospheric air pressure and at temperatures to 90 degrees below zero. So that was enough to work on it first, just to see if we could fail doing that stuff. But what we really didn't want to have happen was for these experiments of ours to drift into some country whose permission we had not yet asked. So we designed our early balloons to fail. We don't do this now, but our very first balloons were made out of latex. And they have this awesome principle that guarantees that they'll fail. Put some helium in the balloon, and the balloon starts to rise. And as it rises, because the air up a little bit is less dense, it expands, it stretches, because latex is stretchy. But when it stretches, its density is less, so it rises some more. And this cycle continues, it just keeps going up until it's at 100,000 feet or so, where it's so thin and so brittle from the cold that it explodes. So these, and this is actually a picture of the moment of it exploding. So being able to know that the failures we had baked into the system would be a safety valve for us so that we could work on other parts of the project was a nice mantra for us early on about the value of failing. Now, of course, failure doesn't always get to be a feature. In the worst case scenarios, it's not only not a feature, you can't even learn from it. It's just a cost that you have to pay. So later on, when the balloon was learning to sail, we had done all these simulations using real-world wind data. And the simulator said, yep, don't worry, it's going to be fine. You're going to be able to make this network of balloons all talk to each other, and all the balloons will sail exactly where you want. But I've seen simulators before. Nothing beats getting out into the real world and seeing what it takes to actually do what the simulator says is possible. So we got out there, and we started getting our balloons to sail. Now, it works now. Now we can set out a balloon on one side of the world and sail it 10,000 to 20,000 kilometers away and have it come within a few hundred meters of where we want it to go. But I assure you, that's not what happened on the 1st or the 50th or the 150th. Those balloons sometimes went where they wanted when we wanted them to go, but often not. And every time a balloon was going somewhere we didn't want it to go, that meant we had to take it down. And taking the balloon down, which is basically just calling out to it to rip itself open, and then it falls out of the sky, that means we have to go get it. And going out to the Arctic Circle in a helicopter to stuff a balloon into the back of the helicopter, headed out into the South Pacific on a boat to go get one of our balloons, not how we want to be spending our time. But it was worth it in order to teach the balloons how to sail, and there was no way other than really getting out there and getting those experiences that would make that possible. One of our projects is building a fully autonomous self-driving car. If you could make a car that really was safer than a person at driving in all of the situations that a person drives, there are more than 1 million lives a year that could be saved, and more than $1 trillion of human time per year wasted sitting in cars when you can't do something else. That would be so powerful to give back to humanity. When we started, we couldn't possibly have had the list of 10,000 things that it was going to take to make this vehicle actually drive safer than a human. We had the top 100, but pretty safe most of the time, just not good enough for any of us, right? Making the list of those 10,000 things that we were going to have to solve is honestly half of what is hard and important about building a self-driving car. And there is no way to make that list other than getting out in the world. Pretty much by definition, if you could make the list just sitting around a conference room, you would just make the list in the conference room, but you can't. So this picture is what the computer can see. This is an unusual, but not as unusual as you might imagine, situation that happened to us, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 months ago. The car was driving on a suburban side street in Mountain View, California. It came around the corner. It's a little side street, there isn't even a yellow line in the middle of the road. And it saw in front of it a woman in an electric wheelchair, which you can see just next to the car there, holding a broom and trying to chase a duck off the road. She's shooing the duck with the broom. And I'm sure that this was surprising to our safety drivers, as much as I can imagine it. I'm sure it was surprising for our car as well. But our car did the right thing. Our car autonomously came to a stop, waited patiently while she shot the duck out of the middle of the road, and then she got out of the road also, and then the car continued on. There is no way that we were in some list we were going to make in a conference room. It would be like, oh yeah, and the duck and sure detector. But that was not going to happen, right? But that's one of the things, one of those 10,000 things that you have to get right. And now that we have this real-world data, it's in our system. So every new piece of software that we have, if we can, we're going to fail in simulation, but using this real-world data and a lot of real-world data like it, when we make the new piece of software, we show it this moment and tens of thousands of things like this, and we say, what would you do now? And then if it makes a bad choice, using the simulator, but the real-world data, if it makes a bad choice, it doesn't get put on the cars. And in that way, all of the cars, and for all future versions of the software, all of our future riders in these cars can all benefit from every failure we have and from every learning moment that we have. It's not about not going out and having these bumps and scrapes. It's about making sure you get full value. The scrapes you get, the better it is for you to have gotten out of the world, not the less so. The thing that we did not do well, that was closer to a failure, was that we allowed and sometimes even encouraged too much attention for the program. What we wanted was to say to the world, this is an early prototype of something that we think is really exciting. What do you think? Where can we go from here? And much of our messaging reflected that. But we also did things which encouraged people to think of this as a finished product. And the world started to talk about it as a finished product. While we were still busy, not trying to productize it, but trying to learn as fast as we can, to fail as fast as we can. And we could have done a better job of communicating that and preventing it from becoming as loud a conversation as it got. So lesson learned, and we'll do that differently next time. But I'm not sorry about those bumps and scrapes. And that loud conversation that happened, and the feedback that we got from it was absolutely critical for informing the future of glass and the future of wearables in general. So one of the things that I would say to you is, if you're considering sizing up your execution risks, your social risks with some product, get out there, get it out there. Prototype, talk to people, show it to people. Let them tell you what's wrong with it. You're gonna find out sometime. Better to find out at the beginning than to find out at the end. This project, the very first question we asked was, could we possibly use someone else's vehicle off the shelf? Because if we don't have to make the vehicle, we'll be able to move forward much faster. All we'll have to do is to make a self-flying vehicle is the sensors and the software. And we looked really hard because we wanted that to be true. But there just wasn't any vehicle that, from a payload perspective, from a speed perspective, and most importantly, from an efficiency, energy efficiency perspective, would have solved the problem for us. So, given that that was true, what kind of a vehicle were we going to build? It had to be a vertical takeoff and landing vehicle, because we couldn't have runways. That constrained it somewhat. We looked at a lot of different kinds, and eventually settled on the tail sitter. This is a picture of those tail sitters. So the way a tail sitter works is it sits on its haunches like this. It has propellers across the top. It goes up straight, kind of like a helicopter, and then it sort of falls forward, and then it goes and runs the same propellers, but now it's a flying wing. It goes like this, and it gets all the efficiencies of being a wing. And then when it gets to its destination, it sort of leans back, and now it's in hover mode again. Seemed like a reasonable thing to try. It was a bit of a trade-off. It's mechanically much simpler than most of the other vertical takeoff and landing vehicles. But it's harder from a control systems perspective. But we figured that that was a good trade because the team that we had at the beginning was just stronger on the control system side than it was on the mechanical side. So we worked on it hard, and it just wasn't the right place. Unfortunately, it was a good thing. But we were torn. I would say 50% of the team knew that it was the wrong answer after 8 months, something like that, into the project. We kept going. 80% of the team, including me, knew it was a failure after a year and a half, and we still hadn't killed it. We were conflicted. The problem is that even though we knew it was likely to be the wrong answer after a year and a half, one of our other mantras is getting out into the world as fast as possible. So we have this one goal, which is fail as fast as we can, admit when something's not working, chop it off ruthlessly, let's just move forward. But on the other hand, we want to get out in the real world as fast as possible. And if we say that this isn't going to work, we're actually delaying getting out in the real world in all those other ways. So the team was back and forth debating this. And Sergey he doesn't like those kind of debates. So he just said, you have 5 months. You're going to do deliveries to non-Googlers 5 months from now, go. And so this had 2 immediate ramifications. The first was it caused the team to double down on their failure. Because in 5 months, there was no way for us to get any other vehicle ready in time. So they had to use this as their vehicle. And that meant we were spending more time on a thing that we knew probably wasn't going to make it. But we did get out into the real world. We did do deliveries to non-Googlers in Queensland, Australia. We learned a ton from doing it. And then as soon as we got back, the team was freed up because we didn't have any impending deadlines. We had just got a big chunk of learning. And so then what they wanted to do, there was now no impediment against. And they just rushed into the new vehicle design. And so even though Sergey's 5-month thing sort of prolonged the problem, it also created a natural end date for it, so that it was easier, and it's quite possible that if we hadn't had the deadline that he had created, we would have extended the wrong thing for even longer. So before we even went to Australia, the team had been looking again at this question of whether there was some vehicle we could buy. We satisfied ourselves again that there wasn't. And they've been designing a new vehicle that's very different from this one. And they're now hard at work on that vehicle, the sensors that go on it, the control systems for it, how it's actually going to deliver the service that we're imagining, and I look forward to telling you about that later this year. All right, now a story about failing to fail. One of the other projects that's really had a fantastic last year or two at Google X is called Project Makani. This is our attempt to make an energy kite, an airborne wind turbine. The goal of this is to harvest the power of the wind for a small fraction of the cost per kilowatt of what normal, traditional onshore and offshore wind turbines can do. If this worked as designed, it would meaningfully speed up the global move to renewable energy. So, just so you understand the physics of why this is so exciting, the big opportunity with the wind is that the higher up you go, on balance, the higher the wind speed is, and the more consistent the wind is. And that's juicier than it sounds, because the power of the wind goes up with the cube of the speed. If you double the wind speed, you get 8 times the power out of it. So there's an enormous benefit to going up higher. The problem is, if you build one of these big towers, and you've seen them out there, the big ones have a hub height, that thing that the blade goes around is about 100 meters, about 300 feet. Those towers weigh between 200 and 400 tons. Building one of those, moving it to the site, which often requires widening roads and all kinds of crazy stuff, putting it at the site, you actually have to have a whole foundation for each of these things, I think a financial foundation, to pay to have it plugged away at the end. That's an incredible amount to spend. And here's the horrifying thing. Going up is almost taking the weight of this thing up with the cube of the linear height. That is, if you double the height of one of these towers, the weight of it goes up by almost a factor 8. So there isn't as much benefit as you would intuitively think about going up if you build the tower. But the thing that we're going to start flying next month weighs 1% that much. So the way that this works is it sits on a perch. It looks like the wingspan of a large airplane, but with no body in it. It has 8 propellers in it, and it lifts off and it pulls out a tether behind it, and it's pulling power up the tether to drive these propellers. It actually looks a lot like a tail sitter we were talking about. But once it gets out to the full length of the tether, which will be about 450 meters, it starts doing big circles in the sky. And then, instead of pulling power up the tether, it puts drag on those 8 propellers, turning them into 8 flying wind turbines, and sends 600 kilowatts back down the tether continuously. When we first were starting to work on this, instead of building the 84-foot one, which is what we're about to start flying, the full-scale version, we built a smaller version, which was 28 feet. And that was to test out all the flight rates to make sure that it would be very stable in lots of different winds. And Larry Page said to me, make sure you crash at least 5 of those test versions of the vehicle. Now, obviously, he wants us to be safe, and we work super hard to be safe in everything that we do. What he meant was, if you're not failing at least some of the time, you could be learning faster. If you're not breaking your experimental equipment at least some of the time, you could be learning faster. And I know he's right. So we picked one of the gustiest, windiest places in North America to test this 28-foot scale model, which is what you can see flying there, at a place called Pigeon Point in Pescadero, California, where the speed of the wind can change by 20 miles per hour in a second or two, and where the direction of the wind can change by 90 degrees in a second or two. And we learned a ton from the 100+ hours of flying we did. But we failed to fail. We didn't crash, not once. And it says something about Google X that we're all kind of conflicted about that. We didn't really want to see it crash, but we all feel like we failed somehow. And there's magic in everyone believing a little bit that we might have failed because we didn't fail.